Hello and welcome to the Consistory of the coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Now, on today's episode of Ask the Consistory, I wanted to address an older video I did titled Lay Preaching and Eldona Inconsistency. So, I did a video a while back on the topic of lay reading and lay preaching. It has actually become the most popular video on this channel, managing to get over 300 views, our most popular video. And in that, I presented the coelc, and I would argue the confessional, biblical, Lutheran position on lay reading and lay preaching. And in that, I went through things like the Church Order of Hoya and the Saxon General Articles. I later followed up by doing a video titled Lay Preaching and the Eldona Inconsistency. This is because in my first video on lay reading and lay preaching, I presented 5 views regarding the topic of lay reading and lay preaching. There is the more left-leaning view in churches like the Lutheran Church of Australia, and I believe also in the Missouri Synod, in which both men and women can do lay reading, and during the lay reading service, they get up and they can read out a pre-prepared sermon. Hence lay preaching. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there are churches like the Orthodox Lutheran Confessional Conference, or OLCC, which says no lay reading can take place at all. So if your pastor is sick or away on holidays, or you don't have a pastor at all, for whatever reason, you can't have service. You can't even have a lay reading service or a devotional service. You just go without church until you get a new pastor. In between them, there are some differing views. There are the more common view held by groups like the Wells and in Australia the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church, which still allows lay reading and lay preaching, that is allowing lay people to read out a pre-prepared sermon during the service, but they have limited it just to the men of the congregation, so only lay men can hold this office of lay reader. Further strictness on that are groups like Eldona and the coelc. Now the coelc holds to the position that we can have lay reading services, particularly the leading of the recitation of Luther's Small Catechism. But however, during this lay reading service, this recitation of the Catechism, the lay person is not permitted to preach. They are not allowed to read out a pre-prepared sermon. Now, in my previous video, I pointed out how the Eldona is inconsistent between their teachings and their practice on this matter, because the Eldona in their Malone theses would say the same thing as the coelc says. They say that a lay person may lead a lay reading service, but they are not to preach during this service, and that includes not reading out a pre-prepared sermon. However, many congregations in Eldona have allowed their custers or lay readers to read out an expository letter written by the pastor on one of the readings for the day. Essentially a mini sermon. So they're inconsistent between their doctrine and their practice. They say that lay people can't read out sermons, but then they find these loopholes where a layperson can read out a letter, which is essentially just a sermon. So you can see here how Eldona is inconsistent. And in that video, I took a clip from Pastor Josh Sullivan's Ask the Pastor, in which he says that a layperson is able to read out a letter during the lay reading service, despite the fact that the Eldona's Malone thesis says that they can't read out a pre-prepared sermon. Now, since I've made that video, Pastor Joshua Sullivan and Pastor Paul Radecki and a few other pastors have parted from the Eldona, and they've formed their new group, the CLM, the Confessional Lutheran Ministerium. Now, the coelc and the CLM have engaged with a bit of back and forth. No real kind of official dialogue at this stage, but much more of a kind of just personal, friendly, theological discussions between pastors. And we have discussed this Eldona inconsistency on lay reading and lay preaching. And because of this, the CLM pastors have reconsidered this former practice of allowing their lay readers to read out these expository letters. And in one of Pastor Sullivan's more recent Ask the Pastor videos, he again discusses the topic of lay reading, and in that he references the Church Order of Hoya and the General Saxon Articles, which allow accuster or a layman to lead a lay reading service, but is strictly forbidden from preaching a sermon. And Pastor Sullivan in this new video presents the CLM view that a layperson may lead a lay reading service, but he may not preach during the service, and that includes reading out a sermon or even reading out a letter. So this now means that Pastor Sullivan and the pastors of the CLM are now in actually full agreement with the coelc on this topic of lay reading and lay preaching. So the coelc is no longer the only church body that holds this position that lay people can lead lay reading service but cannot preach. They cannot read out a pre-prepared sermon. The coelc is no longer the only church that holds that. The CLM also holds that same position as we do. In fact, Aldona holds the same position on paper as the coelc, but in practice, they allow their lay people to do things that their own Malone thesis condemns. And so I'm continuing to keep up my video of lay preaching and the Aldona inconsistency because Aldona continues to be inconsistent on this matter. But I wanted to title this video Lay Preaching and the CLM Consistency because the CLM is being consistent with their beliefs and their practices in the same way that the coelc is consistent with its belief and its practices. And I wanted to end this video by playing a clip from Pastor Sullivan's recent video on lay reading where he talks about the new position that he holds, the position of the CLM, because fair's fair. I called him out in my previous video by saying, look, Aldona's inconsistent and Pastor Sullivan says this, but that's inconsistent with the Malone theses, and I called him out for his inconsistency. And now that he is actually following a consistent theological practice in which his beliefs and his practices are in agreement with each other, I want to reward that. And so in the same way that I called out his inconsistency, now I want to praise him for his consistency and say, well done, Pastor Sullivan and the pastors of the CLM. Glad that you are now consistent in both your doctrine and your practice. And I'm also quite glad to see that we have the exact same position on lay reading and lay preaching. Hopefully in the future we may be able to come to agreement on more theological matters. Here hoping. And so I'm going to wrap up this video now with some clips from Pastor Sullivan's recent video on lay reading. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye, God bless, and enjoy the clips.
In fact, in the late 16th century, Lutheran churches had Kirchners, or Küsters, which was sometimes translated as sexton, but probably better translated in English as clerk. 1557 Saxon articles, they allowed the Kirchner to read the epistle and gospel lesson of the day and sing German hymns in the pastor's absence. So pastor's ill, then the Kirchner would read the epistle gospel and lead some singing. A 1581 church order from Hoya, Germany, enumerates, there's the word, the clerk's responsibility. The ninth responsibility in the church order at Hoya states, when the pastor is ill and no substitute can be obtained, to read to the people the 5 chief parts of the catechism with Luther's explanation and to examine the children in the catechism. So in spite of all the different responsibilities that were laid upon the clerk in the Lutheran churches, leading the divine service in the absence of the pastor was not one of them, nor was reading a sermon or a letter from the pastor one of those responsibilities.